All right, I see we have a few folks starting to fill into our webinar. Thanks so much for taking time to join us today. My name is Claire Jacobs and I work on the marketing team at Onbe. We're really excited for a tactical, quick webinar with two payments experts that will be sharing as we intro into the rest of our program. Before I kick that off, I'm going to hit our recording and we'll have you back to your day in about 30 minutes here. Okay, looks like our recording is up. I'll kick it over to our two special guests today. I'll introduce Bridget Meyer, who is the head of strategic relationships at Redbridge Treasury, to introduce herself briefly.
Yeah, so really excited to be here with my friends at Onbe, introduced to their company just not that long ago. But we work for treasurers and CFOs and advising on cash management, their debt strategies, and also their overall payments, whether that be merchant or just cash management payments. So really excited to be here and geek out a little bit on some data points and payments with my friend Max.
Awesome. And I'm Max Grande. I work for a company called Onbe. Onbe is a corporate payouts gateway, so we help businesses pay individuals and consumers in ways that they want to receive a payment. And I'm going to keep the mic, I think, here. So what we wanted to do on the first slide is really start to set the context on what this whole B2P payment actually is. So in our world, B2P means business to person, and it's effectively transactions where businesses are paying people. So this can include anything from something like an employee wage to an insurance claim payout, a rebate, a refund. Tons of incentives are in that flow as well. But anytime somebody needs to disperse funds to an individual, that effectively is this B2B payment. Now, when you look at the market size, just to ground everybody in how big $3 trillion is, it's about half of the global trade volume annually. So we're talking about significant flows that are in this business to person payout arena. And when you look at the surprising statistic of that, nearly half, or 1.7 trillion, are served today via checks. So when you think about opportunities to get more efficient, how you can control the speed, the expense around issuing a check, we'll get into the details here in a little bit. But surprisingly, it can cost up to $12 to issue a single check. So when you start to add all that together, big market, huge amount of cost, effectively being able to pay individuals. And when you put on your strategic hats, you start to think about from a business perspective how these costs add up and ultimately impact the bottom line. And what Bridget's going to get into here in a few minutes is a lot of these costs often go under the radar, right? So many times we're just looking at a single line item statement. When you start to look from a broad lens, these costs can really add up. We'll spend some time on that. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time from the recipient experience side. So if anybody's received a payment from a business before via check, they're slow, you have to cash it, you have to wait for it to clear. It can cause delays to actually receive those funds and have that individual be able to spend them. It's frustrating, and especially in today's world, it can be a significant inconvenience, which often can tarnish that relationship with who you're trying to pay. So the net of this is the insights are really clear. It's a huge opportunity overall for businesses to improve the experience to individuals that they're paying. And by shifting from these physical paper checks over to more digital streamlined methods, there's several levers that can pull that can also not only save your business time, energy, effort, money, but can grow your business as you think about how a transaction itself can overlay and drive some pretty exciting things, which we'll spend some time on. So we'll jump to the next slide real quick, and just to continue to level set around where this can play. I wanted to represent really 5 high volume industries that we're seeing really the greatest opportunity for shifting from physical to digital can be applied. So anything from a property management, security deposit refund. So you think about property managers paying an exiting tenant. Oftentimes that address may be a little bit gray. They're not sure where they're going to go. There's a big problem that we've seen here in the space with escheatment, right? So maybe you have a number of locations that are really prone to college students, for example, and they're moving all over the place. If they don't cash that check, it becomes unclaimed property. And you'll notice a theme here throughout this presentation where that unclaimed property can really start to add up from a time perspective and a cost perspective. And by digitizing that transaction, you're really in the driver's seat on, have those funds been accessed? How can we retrigger the payment? How can we drive up those rates so that You don't necessarily have to deal as much with that achievement. Real quick on the automotive side, huge opportunity there. We do a lot of payments today in the incentive side, starting to see a lot more pickup in the automotive loan overpayment refund. So anytime you pay off a vehicle and a check is often cut in order to pay somebody, tons of flows through that space, and really a great opportunity to deliver a fast and convenient experience. And then when you think about overlaying some opportunities to drive that recipient maybe back into whether it's buy another vehicle or finance through you again for their new car. Energy and utilities, massive market, right? So it could be a demand response payment out. It could be, again, a closing account balance refund. We're seeing a lot of uptick in the class action space, financial legal services. So you go through, depending on the size of the settlement, oftentimes these could be really low dollar payments that are actually maybe less of a payment amount than the cost it took in order to mail that check, which gets kind of interesting. And then we're seeing, again, a big uptick here in healthcare patient overpayment refunds. So really heavy paper-based market. Checks feel natural in that space, but when you think about the amount of energy that companies have put into being able to accept and receive a payment digitally, there's no shortage of ways that I, as a consumer, can pay somebody. Really, we're seeing a shift in businesses starting to think about how they can get money out, how they can drive efficiencies there, and at the end of the day, embrace these digital experiences, which lets them differentiate from everybody else in this pack. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this, but I'm going to pass the mic to Bridget, who's going to really spend a few minutes here walking us through how you can start to understand your current process, what those costs are, and then really use this as a starting point to think about how you're transforming or have an opportunity to transform what is a cost center today to a strategic tool to drive growth and engagement across the recipient base. All you, Bridget.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Max. What's so funny to me is on my desk at home is a tax refund check for $1.08 cut by the U.S. Treasury. And for me, it's even more interesting because I got my Treasury, my feet cut. My first job out of college was with the U.S. Treasury and their cash management modernization division, of ways to do that. And thinking, how are we still cutting these checks? And then again, for $1, knowing how much is going on in the background and how expensive that was of our own taxpayer dollars issuing checks. I just got back from a European trip where I talked and was at different conferences. Nobody outside of the US can understand why we love our checks. I think anytime we bring it up, we talk to people, nobody really thinks we can make a good business case as to why, oh, this is still so needed for us to write checks. I think my college kids, they don't even have a checkbook. They don't even know how to write one. They know how remote deposit works, but we're seeing such a fraud, increase in fraud on that as well, that when we speak to customers, if there's a roadmap to eliminate checks, I think everyone is looking for it. Really excited about what you guys are doing at Onbe and other companies that are out there to try to really change the perception in American mindsets away from paying people by mailing a check, even with post office fraud, et cetera, that we're seeing. So what my point in this today is going to kind of hopefully give you a roadmap for understanding the data that you are currently getting from your banks, which are typically your service providers for any kind of payment that's going out, especially checks. We think of that. And then how to quantify that, leveraging that data so that it can help make your business case internally to move away from checks. With the end goal, I think, for all of us is how do we get away from checks? So when we dive into cash management, everybody's looking for cost savings. And, rather than, I tell, clients that come to us, we negotiate a lot of bank fees, right? And I tell people, why would you negotiate the price of, your check services when in reality, you should be moving away from checks altogether, right? So we could spend all this time trying to squeeze our banks for as much as we possibly can to make our check processing cheaper and cheaper. But what you're gonna see and what we're already seeing, because we see so much bank fee data, is that banks are starting to price the checks and not reducing their costs, to you, jacking that up because they also want you to move to electronic, right? So we're seeing this trend of, banks not budging on the pricing for anything that's a paper disbursement or a paper receivable like lockbox. So it's going to get more and more expensive to continue the behaviors that we're used to of accepting and sending checks. So that's just what we're seeing in today's market. So step one, we're going to kind of talk through processing costs, and this graph might seem surprising to you, and at first glance it kind of what? But when you look at one line item, the mistake most treasurers make, or analysts that get access to their bank fee data and they say, well, how much am I spending for this? Is it really a problem? They look at one line item on that statement that might say checks paid at 2 cents or 3 cents. That doesn't look that expensive, right? Versus your ACH originated items, or even a push to Zelle transaction or instant payment that we're seeing more with RTP. And then of course, we all know that wires can be more expensive. But when you move to the next slide, when you start looking at the bigger picture of external costs that aren't just that one line item, all of a sudden the different price points can get really more competitive and about the same. We start looking at the costs of reporting of those checks, of the imaging of those checks, and the imaging, the retrieval and online storage of those check images, on top of the fraud services you have to pay for to try to catch any check fraud, right? And reconciliation services, full recon, partial recon, whatever kind of con you can pay for. It all adds to the overall cost of those checks versus, and even in the ACH world, we see lots of reporting fees and reconciliation and fraud filters there too, right? So challenging you today to not look at a single line item, but I'm going to teach you to see some keywords and ways to look at the holistic picture so that you can calculate your cost per item. Now that's just talking external costs, right? So when we move to the next slide, you'll see the impact of the soft costs that are going into it too. So there's the bank fee portion, but then there's your own internal costs of escheatment, like Max said, right? Customer support, chasing down checks and figuring out what's the new payment address for that college student that moved from one apartment to the other, and how do we get them their money, right? The cost of that employee time. Max, I know you have some, this is something that you really coach your clients on a regular basis, right?
Absolutely. It's fun. Let me ask you, Bridget, do you plan on cashing that check, by the way?
Honestly, I wish I could, but you can't even remote deposit it because it's a treasury check with all the special things that they use in card stock, so the check stock, so that you can't remote deposit. So the likelihood of my daughter driving to a branch to physically deposit $1.08, it will sit on my desk probably forever as a perfect example of why we need to move away from checks.
Yeah, I asked that, and maybe this is bad of me to say, but just being in this space, I sometimes get those kind of checks too, and I literally will throw them out because it's like I need to get a digital payment, otherwise it's not worth my time. And guess what? When I do that, the amount of money that it costs the payer of record to handle that, to track the balance, to then go through the process of going to the local jurisdiction and all the reporting around that, it is truly significant. So what we spend a lot of time around is, yes, of course, there's going to be a demographic that may always want to receive a check, and that's fine. But if you can start to overlay digital experiences on top of that, not only does the context of the payment get more clear, maybe incentivization in order to receive that transaction and actually do something with it, but you get all these secondary and tertiary layers of value that get added on when you start to even just try to solve for just escheatment, right? And even just keep that as kind of like a core stepping stone.
I have a good friend. That's her only job at an organization. That's all she does is deal with unclaimed property and escheatment. And I was just like, that is crazy. She's, nobody else can really do it. So she's been doing it for so long. That's an entire FTE doing something that would go away if we moved away from checks. So let's move into the kind of the plan, right? So it's like a 4-step program or 5-step program that we're going to talk about today, but in a different ways. So first and foremost, you need to get access to the information. If you want to start quantifying your external costs of this, you want to start getting that information from the bank. Account analysis statements is what we call them in the US. should be available from your, from your banks in their online banking portal. They always have it where you can download these PDFs. And anyone who knows me and knows that I've spoken before, I'm rarely telling you to go and get the PDF statements from your bank. I'm usually pushing all the digital formats. And so, but if you are not using a software like the Redbridge one that pre-classifies your data for you, you're going to want to have to start with a PDF. And that is in some, also the summary statement is really all you need, because that can help you. The bank typically does have categories on those PDF statements that will help in the classification. So we're going to get the data, we're going to get access to it, focus on some summary statements if you can, unless you want to do an analysis at a detail account level. And it is nice, and I'll tell you why we're going to want some detailed statements when we get to the volume side, but get access to your data. Then we're going to start sorting pieces to isolate the cost of the different payment types, right? So isolating your payments so that I like to equate bank fee exercises as jigsaw puzzles, right? You have lots of pieces that the banks are giving you, every single service line on a statement. It can be a 300 piece puzzle. It can be a 100-piece puzzle, even a 50-piece puzzle. But we're going to have to start with sorting those pieces to help us make some sense out of them. Finding the fees and the charges that are related to that, kind of talking about, is it a processing charge, a reporting charge, an ancillary fees, finding all of those fees, kind of going through a treasure hunt exercise so that you can quantify your total cost. We want to know how much we spend on writing checks, and then we need to know how many checks we wrote, right? And so I'll give you some tips on finding the right volumes to use for your analysis. And then that calculation of the cost per payment becomes a third grade exercise of basic math, so that you can then leverage that across your payment types to make decisions and hopefully build some more business cases. So let's dive deeper a little bit more into isolating those payments. So this is just a little zoom in on some of those pieces that we've sorted, right? Controlled disbursement funding, anything we've tried to find on checks. I'll talk a little bit more about ACH and some of the other ones later, but they're their own animals. But when we look at just checks, we're looking for keywords of anything controlled disbursement, because most of you in the US are using this. Image capturing, especially that you're only going to be imaging a check or a deposit slip or something around check, so whether it's received or paid. Also keyword check, clearly, or printing, reconciliation, right? Positive pay, things like that. But we're looking for the core processing charges of that one line item that we might be looking for to say, what is my one line or core processing charges that I always have to pay related to checks? Then when you go to the next layer down, you're looking for those ancillary fees. If you go to the next slide, you'll see those, right? Fraud services, exceptions, reporting, posting, printing, payee name, pause pay, payee, P-pay, every kind of thing that you might, these all code words that get put into there that are all related to a check. Image storage. In this case, this bank actually had host-to-host check items reported. I can tell you most banks don't. They just have your previous day reporting. It can be a BAI per transaction fee. What I want to have you think about, and this is where your detail account statements could almost be even more helpful in finding these things, because you can follow the volume trail. That's what I like to tell our analysts when we're doing our bank fee boot camps. Follow the bank fee, follow the trail of the volume. If I see how many checks I wrote, do I see any other line items in there that have a similar volume? So maybe it's a posting fee or a reporting fee or something that has that exact same volume. That's going to help you find the fees that are related to it. Ask yourself, and even your bankers or your consultant, and this is where we coach a lot of clients, like, if you were to pick up and move all of this check business and switch it to ACH or move it to another bank, what would go away? How would that volume be changed on any line item on your analysis statement? And then double checking that, okay, if I eliminated this, this now goes away. That's all the fees you want in your exercise. So once you have found all your fees, you've gone on your treasure hunt. Now we go to the next, fun part of just calculating that, right? So we now know in this month, I spent $2,679.91 related to all of the checks. This is the answer to how much. When you get to the how many, right, which is now we're going to talk more about the volume, we have to make sure we don't double count any volumes, but we also want to make sure we don't forget any volumes. So you're looking for keywords like control disbursement or checks paid or posted. So in this example, the bank is using the control disbursement check posted to tell you what that number of checks are that you're writing. Other banks, they won't use this at all. It'll just be checks paid or something along those lines. So you want to figure that out. Once you have those volumes put together, I do simple math. I know that my cost per item this month was $3.25. Now, of course, month over month, hopefully as your initiatives of eliminating checks goes down, that cost per item could potentially go up, right? Because you're not getting the benefit of a lot of volume. That's where having the conversation with your bank and looking at the different pricing strategies of the different banks to know how many fixed costs, so versus those that are transaction based versus maintenance fees, because typically you're paying fraud positive pay items at an account level and also at the transaction level. So depending on the bank and how they're charging, as your volumes decrease, that cost is going to go even higher. So just something else to consider. And then when you look at $3.25, it's not quite the $12 that was on the original slide, but because you're factoring in all of those soft costs of time, escheatment, salaries of FTEs doing nothing but unclaimed property, right? All of those other things that go into the total costs can really drastically move the needle. When we look at the other payment types, so we focused a lot on checks today, but to me, it's really interesting to do the exercise across different payment types and to give that insight to our clients. It's your cost of $3.25 for a check versus maybe an all-in cost of an ACH item of $1 or 20 cents, for crying out loud. It could be, depending on the number of volumes. And again, the more you shift away from one to another is going to change your volume types. ACH can be tricky if you do this analysis, right? Because you do have a lot of reporting charges. You still have fraud filters, positive pay fees for exception processing, all of that, and the time that's associated with doing those, checking those ACH debit filters and maintaining those. And what's also tricky is the posting fees that can be in other categories like general account services that are related to ACH items. So just keep that in mind. When you're looking at a wire, you have your domestic wires, your international wires. Sometimes in foreign countries, you're looking at telegraphic transfers or SWIFT payments. So the exercise is complex enough just in the US. You layer on the international, whole other story. You're trying to figure out what all of these different payment systems are, CHAPS, BACS, et cetera, what bucket they fall into. And we are seeing, a trend, and it's been started a few years ago, but now I think even more so with the whole RTP and FedNow push, we're seeing more of a push to instant payments, right? Like a push to Zelle. Now we see this very popular on the P2P, but less so now for B2P, but this is where I think the opportunity is, to your point, Max, right? How do we get this so we can change to a virtual card payment where my 22-year-old is receiving, instead of $1.08 on a paper check she's never going to see, a push to a card payment that she can immediately add to her wallet and use, right? Or into her Venmo or into her Zelle account. So there's no additional real action needed. So hopefully it's just, this was a lot of information in a short period of time, but calculating those costs is not a one size fits all. It's not just one line item. You have to factor in many of the others, but it can be a lot of fun when you get it all together and you can analyze those costs for payment types.
I think it's incredible, Bridget. So in my experience, depending on kind of who you're speaking to in the org, and then also where their experiences lie, we'll go in and have some initial conversations where we flash up that statistic up to $12, and people are like, "There's no way this is true." And then over the course of the process, they bring in other people. They're like, "Yeah, it's actually higher than that." And so it's incredible when especially the people in the weeds, such the appreciation of how much really goes into even just answering the phone and the questions of, hey, where's my money? And then having to go do a pull up, check, see when it was cut, see if it has been cashed. The number of portals that the customer support needs to log into in order to access that can also be like quite cumbersome as well. So what we wanted to do here was just really start to isolate and reiterate some of what was Bridget was saying around taking that wide lens approach, especially if you're not just on one modality, right? And being able to look at and really start to identify, or at least just have in the back of your head these hidden soft costs, which over time can really balloon expenses and go under the radar. So whether it's postage, it's significant fraud risks, if any companies have ever gone through that, extensive reconciliation efforts, again, on trying to do things like batch clearing and when do certain end of days line up, especially if you're even across multiple time zones in the US or at the global level, it can get really cumbersome. So as we think about things like incorporating digital payments like virtual cards, offering more cost-effective and secure ways to deliver these payments, they can systematically start to eliminate these. You'll notice that first virtual card line item, for example, there's no cost associated with several of these, whereas some of these other physical modalities fully burdened with them. So we jump to the next slide. I really wanted to start to transition the conversation over. So we've got kind of a good footprint and exercise. And it sounds like, Bridget, from your experience, maybe several people potentially involved in being able to source some of those different files and pull them together, I would imagine. So from our perspective, that's like the clear advantage is cost reduction. Checks, when you get into the space and you start to do that analysis, you're going to be blown away at how surprised you are and how high those costs are. But beyond that, we work with companies every day where speed to a payment, escheatment nightmares, and by moving to these digital modalities, they're able to, again, like get into that transaction workflow, better track and see that payment history as it goes through creation to acceptance to actually being leveraged. There's more to the story here though, and I wanted to spend a couple minutes on this slide because cost and efficiency, internal, external, fantastic. But really when you take a step back and you look at where a B2B payment occurs, it's really a strategic touch point between a business and a consumer. And what I mean by that is that each payment is really an interaction and it's an opportunity to build the relationship with that individual, to reinforce your brand. It's effectively free marketing if you're delivering a payment and you can all of a sudden put your logos on that transaction and really facilitate somebody actually interacting with that payment. And then the beautiful thing that we've really seen is how, when you're delivering that transaction, how can you start to influence that behavior? And whether it's to cross-sell, upsell into another line of product, to maybe get them to spend back to you, just to continue that engagement, to be a repeat buyer or client in the future. Ultimately, when you deliver this digital modality, you deliver that touch point, your brand resonates. It's really an opportunity to strengthen loyalty to your business and ultimately drive them to use those funds in a certain way, which can lead to things like unlocked revenue, additional efficiencies, your cost of acquisition can go down, some really, really cool things that we've seen from different clients in different spaces. So at the end of the day, what we really lean into is not only is there the cost save, the efficiency save, but it's really the perfect platform, a digital transaction, to capitalize on this strategic touch point. Personalized payment experiences, continued engagement. There's so many opportunities to turn that routine transaction into a positive and memorable interaction. So you're good, Claire. We can go to the next one because what I wanted to do, so now you're starting to wrap your head around, okay, there's a ton of cost in here. We're starting to isolate that. We understand the value goes beyond just cost savings. We can improve our experiences. We can find other opportunities to drive growth. The third thing in my mind is really taking a step back and indexing on the asks of the recipients themselves. So in the payments ecosystem, you can get so wrapped up in kind of the behind the scenes, how do things work? being able to pause for a second and really listen to your customers as they're receiving the payments and what do they want is instrumental in adding layers to that business case and driving that growth. So just being in the space, we do a ton of this here at Onbe, and we have some really interesting numbers and statistics when you look at it. So it goes into choice, speed, security, flexibility, all of the things that consumers are asking for, being able to serve those up in a digital experience. So the first one here, leading with digital, especially in, I would call it the last even 5 years, right? The amount of technology increase and just adoption, when I think 5 years ago of being able to take my mobile wallet and tap to pay at individual merchant locations, the number of merchants that accept that tap to pay now is dramatically improved. And when you mix that capability on top of the immediacy of a virtual card payment and being able to add it to your mobile wallet, it's no longer the world of, great, I've got a card number, now I need to go and type this in order to make a transaction. You can literally add it to your phone and within seconds be transacting at a merchant of your choice, which is really slick. The second is around choice. So I touched on it a little bit earlier, but you're going to have, especially if you're a company with scale on your payouts, different demographics of recipients that are interacting in different ways. Bridget, to your point, individuals in your family may not even know how to cut a check. They may be using Cash App all day. They may be fully out of their bank account. So by being able to incorporate choice and really meet the recipient where they're at on how they want to be paid, it drives a lasting impression and also accelerates that time for the individual to receive those funds, to utilize those funds, ultimately driving down your customer support requests, because you're no longer getting the call on, hey, where's my money? Within seconds, it's in their hands and they're able to leverage it. And your brand's around it too, which I think brings me to my third point is more than half of the recipients that responded to this survey were raising their hands saying security is important, and we believe that digital payment modalities are the most secure. So when you can do things like add context to the payment, add messaging, tie it into why they're receiving that payment in the first place, it goes way beyond just getting an email and clicking a link. You can do a ton of things in order to drive that individual's acceptance of that payment and ultimately how they go and transact with those funds, which is quite cool.
And it still gives you the option of like having somebody like my mom who wants the check, right? To say, okay, I have the ability to request that if I want, but to be able to send a payment file that says pay my 22-year-old, and everyone have the ability to kind of let them opt out if they want, but save yourself a lot of time and money in the meantime, right?
Yeah. I think that's a great call out too, Bridget. So if you're a company and you're saying, okay, my ears are peaked, right? I'm interested. I'm doing a lot of checks today. Maybe I'm doing ACH. Maybe you want to get into maybe a virtual card or a push to card payment or PayPal or another wallet. All of a sudden, it can get quite overwhelming if you are doing individual integrations, individual reconciliations around that. So as a part of just the exercise of going through the motions, there are providers that are able to aggregate all of that experience, tuck it up into a nice bundled package. And to your point around delivering a file, likely a very similar file with very similar fields, but if you're putting choice in the hands of the recipient themselves, you're almost indifferent on how they want to receive the payment. You're just setting up the framework for them to be able to receive how they want to receive. So just starting to think through and reinforce some of the points here. So we kind of teed up B2B payments at large, massive market out there, tons of transactions going through, tons of transactions that are still checks going through. And we've really started to see a proliferation around consumers being able to request different ways in order to receive a payment. Bridget spent a good amount of time kind of going through the real cost of the payment, highlighting the importance of both direct, indirect, the soft costs, all of the downstream parties that get touched when something goes wrong with a check, for example, and then starting to think through the additional value that can get added into the ecosystem when you start to digitize your payments. So from a business perspective, right, there's really kind of, the list can go on, but if you're considering going through this exercise, for example, really understanding how high your operational costs all in. We've seen a ton of spaces too with regards to increased regulatory pressure. So especially around cash, right? So being able to deliver a cash payment to an individual, a lot of states are actually going through and saying, you can't do that anymore. You need to digitize that transaction. which is quite interesting. And then you start to marry that on top of how can I start to maybe incorporate some of these things like a virtual card, like push to card, and still be able to maintain that that regulatory status that oftentimes company leads into checks around. There's some great opportunities to not only deliver a fast payment, but start to hang modalities off of that initial interaction, which you can start to expand into different use cases, which gets quite cool. And then at the end of the day, I think this is core to what I do here at Onbe is being able to index on that customer experience. What do people actually want? And then if you can start to realize operational efficiencies on top of that, it ends up being a no-brainer when you put all the pieces of that 50 to 300 piece puzzle together that Bridget was calling. So, Bridget, any other thoughts kind of as we look to start to find out a little bit?
I love your point about, the compliance, or you have a timestamp of the delivery of that payment, right? Today, a company issues a file for outsourced check printing. All of those get mailed. You have postage costs on top of that, and there's no certainty of when it received. The answer when that client calls and says, "I never got my money," it's, well, we put it in the mail on this date, right? It was mailed on this date, but there's no certification of delivery on the other side. In a digital payment environment, it's like, well, we delivered you this virtual card on this exact time and date. Check your phone or check your email, and there's a timestamp where you have a record of telling them where to look for it if there's ever any issues with that. Now, I think every treasurer I talk to, they want to digitize Treasury. Digitizing Treasury can mean a lot of different things, but in the US, I think the number one thing is we need to think and get less manual and more digital, and leveraging these electronic payments. Get up with the rest of the world. We Americans think we're so cool and all that holistically, but so many countries, even those third world countries, are far advanced from us when it comes to payments. And I think it is time for us to kind of level up and make that happen. And maybe you who are on this webinar can be that champion within your organization that can say, I did this, I found a solution for us, and we're able to answer those questions to become the superhero that actually moved your company to this century, right? Outside of checks. So that would be my really excited to be with you here again, Max. Thanks again for the invitation. And I think it's time for questions if anybody has any.
Thank you both. Big virtual round of applause from everybody on the Onbe team and everybody listening. I think while we give folks who are able to spend a little bit more time with us, maybe a minute or two to marinate on their questions, I'd love to kick us off with something to chew on, just more so on. Bridget, I know you mentioned whether it's PDF or a .csv or maybe an Excel, whatever you can access, it really starts with getting your documents to analyze. If I'm somebody that's an analyst inside a company, how would I even think about getting started to try to figure out those high level costs? What would be my, call it, first 3 steps?
So ideally, you would have access to a good bank fee software that would have the ability to then also, Redbridge has one, of course, where we classify that data for you, which takes all the manual typing and data entry out of the way. When it comes to that on an international scale, so you're right, we have the EDI files in the US that can be fed into that. You want to ask your bank for Excel data if they have it, or Twist BSB or CAMP 086. There's all kinds of international formats for this as well. But if you want to be able to do the exercise, maybe it's just one time because you want to move away, or I would challenge you to really think about using this as a metric that you can report to senior management on, or AP, or be that bridge to the AP department if you're in Treasury that can then calculate and monitor that payment over time, right? So go from $3.28, and then maybe that becomes a benchmark of a target that your team wants, right? I want to move down to under $2, or I want to move down to whatever, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean just from negotiating with your bank, though if that can be the case, and we're happy to help you do that, right? To benchmark what is the average fair price for that in today's market. And so Redbridge helps you with that as well. But I think first is getting access to the best type of data. Sometimes those PDFs are on, and in the US, they're always available. International banks don't necessarily put that on your online banking portal, so you have to ask them. But in the US market, I would just start there.
That is super helpful. I am checking out our question banks and we got a great thank you so much for sharing. How generally does that conversation go with your banking partner about using providers like Onbe? If that kind of implicates the transactions a bank might get volume to, how is the reaction typically?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. So banks are really interested today in maintaining deposits and that relationship with their customer because they have a number of other products that they can cross-sell, upsell, right? So there's kind of two flavors of banks. One, Onbe does not require somebody to actually start to bank with us. So those banks still have that relationship with that end corporate entity. They're just delivering transactions to a fulfillment vendor that can digitize that transaction. Spoken to banks that actually appreciate that because they, Bridget, maybe the one individual that you know, they actually have teams of individuals that are likely working through quite manual, cumbersome processes in order to handle whether it's the cost of the check or the sheetment or the internal reporting. You'd be surprised at how manual some of these like uploads are to digital banking. So there's that component. And then we've seen a number of banks who are recognizing that they need to switch to digital because their treasury clients or customers of their treasury clients are asking for alternative modalities. And Onbe has stepped into some of those relationships as well to help those banks start to digitize those transactions themselves. So it's understood, I think, at large that checks are slow, expensive, cumbersome, paper-based. People don't like getting them. The industry at large is recognizing that need for change, and whether it's Onbe stepping in or a bank starting to understand how they can maybe realize some internal efficiencies, right? They're ultimately, in my experience, quite excited about offloading some of that pain onto somebody else.
And just from my side, I would just say that banks want to help you digitize your treasury as well, right? They want you to move away from checks because at the end of the day, they don't want to be receiving them and processing them either on a lockbox side. So, we're seeing that trend where they can make a lot more and more efficiencies in-house and not having to process those paper payments, to your point. So I've never seen a banker say, no, you should keep your checks because I want that check revenue. Like, that's just crazy. I think it's a conversation that you definitely want to have with your banker if and when that comes up.
That is super helpful. I'm taking a look at all the other questions rolling in. And one of them that I'm seeing here is, and it's kind of Bridget to the exercise that we were going through together when I was building this, having a little bit of trouble just finding some of those keywords and line items that we just mentioned briefly today. What is the best way to ask for help with something like that? Is there any streamlining resources? Do they need to talk to Redbridge? What's the best way for somebody thinking about an individual starting to analyze by themselves?
Yeah, so you have to start. I ask that there's 3 questions you have to know when it comes to bank fee analysis. What is the service? Who's using it in your organization and why, right? To me, you shouldn't be paying any vendor if you don't know for services if you don't understand what they are, who's using it, or why. So you have to start going through, if you're an analyst on this call, going through that journey, which I had to do. And I have to tell you, it's been 20 years and I am still on the journey because the banks are always coming up with new line items and new ways of charging. So different names, they only get so many digits to put that on a statement. So they use some codes and things like that you can either go line by line with your banker or you're, absolutely connect with me in Redbridge. That's what we do, is really educating our clients on what those services are, those 3 questions. So that then that helps you put those in the right buckets, right? Making sure you're not missing a key points in your analysis and setting up that reporting in a way where it is something you can track and show your success over time. I think that's the fun part. Is at bonus time has been performance review, right? Well, I took us from X to Y, and I reduced our cost per payment, and I created all of this revenue for this company. That's a really great opportunity for somebody who dives deep.
Beautiful. And I think that about takes us to time on questions. So I want to be mindful of everybody's schedules. And again, a big thank you to Bridget and Max for sharing your time and expertise with us today. For folks who want to follow up, of course, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar with the LinkedIns of both of our speakers today. We'll have emails as are on the screen right now that are being shared. And if there are any questions, we encourage you to reach out via LinkedIn or via these emails, but we will be in contact with all of the content and a wrap up of what we were able to share today. So again, thank you both. Thanks those who shared their time to just jump on today. We appreciate your expertise.
Awesome.
Thanks all.
Appreciate it.
Bye.